In this episode, I talked to our good friend Alex Paradies from TapRooT. We get together and talk about why situational awareness cannot be a root cause to workplace incidents. Yet we continue to see worker wasn't aware of their surroundings, worker wasn't paying attention, all these root causes and corrective actions being written up to incidents that call this out. It's a great conversation. I learned a lot in this episode, as I usually do when I talk to the folks at TapRooT, but it's a really interesting episode, and I hope you get a lot out of it as well. So let's jump right into it. Before we get into today's topic, I want to remind everybody, if your business is reopening after any kind of closure due to COVID, or you've continued to remain open, but you're struggling with how to mark your facilities to ensure physical distancing and relay important information about safety and health as it relates to COVID, I want you to go visit our friends over at Mighty Line Floor Tape. Mighty Line has some great products for you to mark your floors, whether it be the stand here, the 6 feet distancing, or just floor tape to denote lanes of travel. They have everything you need to mark your facilities. So hit the link in the show notes, visit our friends at Mighty Line Floor Tape. They are incredible partners in safety. I can't thank them enough for their support of the podcast. Again, Mighty Line Tape for all of your floor marking needs. All right, Alexander Paradies, second time, right?
Second time.
That's right. Now it's a trend, so you can't stop it now. All right. We're going to talk today about something, and I've got an article pulled up here, a TapRooT article, and we were talking offline about this. We're going to follow up with, the last time we talked about precursor incidents, and we talked about the significance of those. And we're going to talk about another topic that you got me thinking as we were chatting earlier about our interview here, setting it up. Got me thinking about some corrective actions and root causes that I see written a lot that have to do with situational awareness. So just to remind everybody who may have not seen our previous interview, go ahead and introduce yourself and where you're from, what you do, and your organization.
All right, I'm Alex Paradies. I'm with System Improvements. We teach TapRooT root cause analysis. So my background's very much in understanding problems, how people make mistakes, and what to do to fix them.
Nice. I love it. Short and sweet, and it gets right to the point. So, so what is situational awareness? First of all, again, we were talking offline there. We're not talking in terms of personal protection. Like, I'm going to the grocery store and I should probably be aware of, I park under a light. I make sure there's enough people. There are other people around. I don't see sketchy folks hanging around the door, or if I go to the ATM, that's a different type of situational awareness. We're talking in the workplace, we're talking with workers, and it's usually in the context of, well, you should have seen that coming, or you should have anticipated that happening. So let's talk about situational awareness. What is it in that context?
Yeah, and I think that's a great starting point, because a lot of people imagine situational awareness. They think of it like the Jason Bourne movies, right? He's seeing everything and he's processing it all, and he just has all the information and knows how everybody's going to move, right? And that's a good way to think about it, but in our own daily lives, we know we can't respond like Jason Bourne. So when we think about situational awareness, there's 3 elements that they've broken it into, and this is from a lot of different research, but they really like to break it into 3 different elements. And that's, first one is perception. I have to receive information. It has to come in through my senses. Might be sight, sound, taste, smell, hearing, any of those kind of things. We're perceiving all this information at all this time. And so I've got to be able to see it. I've got to be able to see that hazard present. And then I have to comprehend it. So that second element is comprehension. So I have to not just be able to see that there's a problem. I have to comprehend and understand that it's a problem. The third element is projection. So if we take this element and we think about the Jason Bourne example first of this that kind of he's seeing all these hazards, the bad guy walks in the room and he's understanding, oh, this is that I could tell that guy's a spy, right? He can tell he's a spy. He comprehends it and knows it. And then he's going to project what the guy is going to do next, and he's going to position himself so that he can counter that. So that's the spy thinking of it. Well, in our daily lives, in operations, we might be getting signals from our equipment. We might be getting information sources from our processes and signals from the guy that's telling us what to do with the crane we're operating. And so we have to perceive those signals, understand what they mean in relation to us, and then be able to project what's going to happen next. So if I'm a fork truck driver and I'm driving in a warehouse and there's another guy and I perceive this guy coming down the other aisle, I have to comprehend, is he slowing down? Do I have right of way? Who's got right of way? And I need to project what's the next step to happen. Oh, I need to stop and he has right of way. Or, oh, I have right of way and he's coming. I can see that his lights are slowing, that his brake lights are on and he's slowing down. So I have right of way and can to continue forward. So that's that element of situational awareness, the ability to perceive what's going on, comprehend it, to understand it, and to project what's going to happen next. So that's kind of those three different elements.
And, as you were talking, I'm like, okay, that typically in workplace accidents, when we write up lack of situational awareness as a root cause, which we'll get to that in a moment, or they write it up in the corrective action. Worker didn't see that or didn't turn to look before taking a step. So therefore, the corrective action is we're going to help them increase their situational awareness. It's really all on them. As you were talking, in that context, I'm going back on just some recent cases that I've read about. That first one wasn't even there. That first, they didn't even have an opportunity to actually process and then project what could happen because they never saw it, or it was out of their line of sight. They couldn't hear. It was an fixed object and they didn't see it. They couldn't hear it, of course. And when they went to do something, went to bend over, it was a good example. There was something hanging on a wall. It was a box hanging on the wall and they walked by and they didn't really look at it. And maybe they're just so used to it being there, they don't see it anymore. They don't comprehend it anymore. It just factory blindness. I call it the wallpaper effect, right? Just blends in. And they went to pick something up and they stood up into this thing. And so they wrote it up, situational awareness, not aware of your surroundings. Going to do a stand-up on, meeting about being aware of your surroundings. And I'm thinking, why not put two little posts on the floor and where that thing is sticking out? It was some emergency equipment that had to be there. So regulation says it's got to be there, but put two posts so that your body can't physically get under it to stand up into it. Change the environment. Can it be recessed into the wall? Why is it sticking out? Is it drywall? Can it be recessed? Why aren't we making these cabinets the size to fit between two studs, metal studs or wood studs in a drywall, sheetrock wall? I mean, my brain's just going on, and not until we talked and until you laid that out did I realize it can't be situational awareness. And the way we can prove this is if we then let's jump to what is a root cause. Let's define what you all define as a root cause, because I love the TapRooT definition. I use it all the time.
Yeah, so it's the thing we think about when we're thinking about what is actually a root cause. A root cause is a missing best practice or missing piece of knowledge that if we had this and we had exercised this best practice, we would have either prevented the incident from occurring or reduced its likelihood of occurrence. So the idea is with root causes, we're looking for something, a technique, a best practice, a thing that we could do that would make it where this incident won't happen again. So just telling somebody to be more careful. Well, if we think about that, if I tell someone to be more careful, is that a missing best practice, being really careful? Is that something that's really going to prevent an incident? When we look at people, people ask, okay, how good are people at perceiving information, comprehending it, and projecting what's going to happen in the future. How good are we at actually doing that? And, it's interesting. We're pretty decent because, we can walk and not run into things constantly. So we do okay. But like you said, that wallpaper effect might come into play. There's sometimes where things are just, they're just hidden. I did a webinar, or not a webinar, I did a session on hazard identification. And I put up a picture, and it just looks like an empty, rocky field. And I said, okay, you're getting ready to go on this job site. What are some of the hazards you see? And everybody can see, there's boulders. It might be fall down. Maybe there's some sticks and other things. There's some tripping hazards. Kind of looks like there's a hole over there. Well, you can't see right in the middle of a picture. There's a leopard sunbathing in the rock. I was going to
ask, is this the leopard or mountain lion?
Yeah. There's one of those. And so it's like, it's hard sometimes to perceive that stuff. And so people aren't very good at that. And so when you just default to tell them to be more careful, well, you need to look extra hard next time you go to the job site, or those kind of things. And even when there's a leopard, you've seen the picture, the picture exists, you're looking for a leopard, it can still be difficult. You're like, I know it's in here. It's something. There's a snake. There's a leopard. It's somewhere in here. And you still may not see it because, we're fallible. People make mistakes. You can lose situational awareness due to memory errors. You can lose situational awareness due to things just like normal distractions, not even talking our cell phones, right? Those things distract us all the time and cause us to lose situational awareness. But just little things like, I was taking a collision avoidance training class back when I was a teenager. And I was they had a police officer in the car with me, and they were doing things. We were doing a backup training thing, and I had to do this big S curve in reverse. And I was doing really well, but all of a sudden the officer's walkie-talkie just goes off, just a real quick little thing of noise. And it took me out of the moment. I spun the car around and did a little and I was doing really well. I was speeding through this course. I was doing great in reverse. And all of a sudden that little moment broke me out of this cycle. And that's something people don't think about either with situational awareness. It's not like a one-time occurrence. It's a constant cycle of as I receive new information. You're aware of the Miracle on the Hudson, right?
Yes.
So imagine yourself, you're taking off in the airplane, you're doing a normal routine for you. You're an experienced pilot. You've taken off from LaGuardia 1,000,000 times, right? So he takes off and you get up into the air and suddenly you get hit by a flock of geese and they take out both your engines. And there's a moment right there at the beginning where you're having to perceive, I've hit geese. Oh man, what's going on? My engines aren't responding. I've lost both of them. What's my altitude at? So now you're in this comprehension phase and you're trying to figure out, what do I know? What's my altitude? What's my descent rate? Okay, how much time do I have before I crash?
Right.
So that's comprehension. Now you're getting information. You've called in the emergency. You're getting more information from air traffic. They're telling you got to make a big turn and land at Teterboro. And you go, oh man, let's do the little mental math. Again, we've perceived. What do we know now? What's our comprehension? What is it? What's my descent rate like? Am I going to make it? I'm not going to make it. What's my next option? So you go through this in cycles. It's not like a split second thing always. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it can be a longer period of time where you have to constantly get new information and continue that cycle. So when we think about corrective actions, like you're saying, and we want to get away from the simple tell them to do better next time or tell them to be more careful. Well, we have to look at where that breakdown in situational awareness occurs. Is it in the perception? Is it in the comprehension? Is it in the projection? So think back to your little example, the box, right? This guy, he didn't perceive that he was under the box, and he didn't comprehend that when he stood up, he was going to bump his head, right? That's a little simple one. So if we think about how do we get them to perceive better, well, what kind of signage, what kind of barriers can we put in place to make it, if you have posts, that would at least tell you when you're under that zone. If you've got something like, just make it a full cabinet, right? It goes all the way to the ground. You can't get your head under that. So again, you can engineer out those and put in place those controls. So I think it's a good way of thinking about it. Now, an interesting piece of data, and it's not this doesn't give a complete picture, but it's a pretty good piece of data. Inslee did some work on this, and she took some incident data from air traffic controllers, and she looked at all these misses, and she categorized them into perception, comprehension, and projection. Did they not perceive the information? Did they misinterpret the information that they got? Or did they fail to figure out what was going to happen with that information and something that occurred? And what she found from that data was 78% of errors occurred because they did not perceive the information they needed.
Wow, that's a lot.
It's a lot. So like we're talking almost 80% here was a perception problem. Now, that changes based on the task that people are doing, but I've found in my little, anecdotal evidence that perception tends to be the largest chunk, at least from my experience, that for the most time people are just failing to perceive that information that they need. Sometimes they misinterpret what they're actually perceiving. That's, I think, the second most. And I think the last one, the least one on the general, is going to be that fail to project what happens next. And I think for most tasks that we deal with, in safety at least, that tends to be the case. When you're getting to more like knowledge-based decisions kind of things, then that fail to project comes up a lot when I'm having to make interpretive decisions. But a lot of times it's just, I didn't realize this was going to happen. I didn't see that bit of information. I didn't notice the thing was above my head, right? That's the most common. So when we think about how do we fix that, let's start with the projection, the perception, because I think that's the biggest one. So we need to think about things that are related to how do we improve perception. Now, with TapRooT, we talk about this from a human-machine interface and human engineering standpoint. And I think I told you guys last time, my definition of human factors is making things intuitive to do right, hard to do wrong. So when we're perceiving, how do we make it easy to perceive information, hard to miss that? So an example that you might think of is an alarm, right? Alarms are really good ways of giving people information, right? It's a really good way. Fire alarm is pretty clear. There's a fire, it's hard to miss that. Now, if I've got my big clunky headphone, my Bose headphones on, and they're noise canceling, okay, well, how do I make it where that if somebody can't hear, how do I still get their attention?
A strobe, yeah.
So some sort of strobe light. So again, we're thinking about, okay, how do we increase those levels of perception? And there's a lot of different senses, right, that you can apply to this and try to get that information. Certainly a fast way to clear your factory floor would be to have a fart bomb go off if there was a fire, but I don't think that's probably what we'd go with, but that certainly would clear a room, right? So again, you're thinking of how do you increase that perception? That would be something. Right? Again, not the corrective action I'm recommending, but just a thing, an idea of thinking about it.
But what you're talking about there with corrective action is key, because it does go back to the definition of a root cause. And I do think we should clear one thing up, because a lot of folks get hung up on this word or phrase, or part of the phrase, lack of knowledge. And they're like, oh, well, the worker didn't know. It was like, no, we're not just talking about the worker. We're talking about the organization. We're talking about our processes, our lack of knowledge of this environment, how we set this factory, this warehouse, or this place up, and how we can improve it, how we can make it more resilient to what we know is going to happen, because it's human nature, and that is people are going to be milling around, working, walking around, doing multiple tasks, and they're not always going to see this stuff. So we have to help, like you said, we have to help increase the chances they're going to perceive this, or eliminate the need to perceive it. Like you said, a cabinet hanging on a wall, make it a full cabinet, put 2 plastic bollards, bolted to the floor. They're cheap. You can't get under it if you have to pick something up. I mean, those are tied to an actual root cause. And that's where I like to go, like front to back, back to front, right? I like to start with the corrective actions and work backwards and go, this makes no sense to even what you determined to be the root cause. Sometimes they nail the root cause and just fall flat on the corrective action because they don't make that connection. So And I noticed that, the hierarchy of controls comes into play, right? When we talk about, we have some options. And I always tell people, like, look, the more severe and likely the incident, even the potential, right? And the higher on the controls you should probably be focusing. And based on our last conversation, if it's a paper cut, like very low probability, low hazard, you're probably, if anything, you're looking at the rock bottom of that one. It's probably, we make the little finger cots available for the admin worker that's going to be flipping through papers. But other than that, I mean, there's not a whole lot you're going to be able to do for that. But again, it goes back to fully understanding what and how something took place, and even running it out a little further to say, okay, well, in this case, X happened, but what if it was somebody else in that situation? Could Y have happened, which is worse, right? And then that kind of informs us as to where we are on the hierarchy. So obviously removing or reducing, mitigating the hazard itself, like at the source. And you mentioned removing the target. Well, that would be the person, right? Does the person need to be there?
Yep.
And that's something a lot of folks miss, I think. Do you have any other tips on sort of the safeguard hierarchy?
So you bring up too. So most people are familiar with the hierarchy of controls. That's kind of a standard that most people rolled out. We developed kind of simultaneously, oddly enough, but we have a very different but similar, which is the safeguard hierarchy. And the difference between ours is thinking about, one's about control of energy, and ours is about effectiveness of corrective actions. And so where administrative controls is one block on there, ours is separated out and a little bit differently, and we include human engineering. So when we think about this hierarchy and we think about how we're affecting people, if we have an issue where somebody failed to perceive something or failed to comprehend something, we need to think about how that interacts with that person. So if I can get rid of the hazard, that would be great. If I can remove or relocate the target so they're not around the hazard, that's great as well. But if I can't do those things, well, I need to think about how I can set things up. Maybe I can guard. If I can guard, great. But sometimes there's hazards that, we have spinning discs, spinning saw blades, and they're going to be present. So we have to figure out something that's going to be human engineering as well, and not just going to be a physical guard. Guards are great, but sometimes there's stuff that we have energy that we can't disperse or get rid of. So we think about how do we increase that perception, comprehension, and projection of what's going to happen. So we talked about perception, right? Human engineering, making it more intuitive to see and detect the issue. Well, the other thing we can do for comprehension is we can look at how we're building our systems, and we can allow time for things like ability to comprehend it. So if I've got a task that I'm doing and I have to make quick decisions based off of information that I'm getting, well, if I can do something to slow that process down a little bit and give people more time to comprehend information that's coming in and figure out what's happening next, that's going to make it where a person is more likely to make the right decision. 3 Mile Island is an interesting example. Wow. So we had Ed Fredericks come, and he did a presentation at our conference years ago. It was about 10 years ago, probably. And he presented out. And one of the things that stuck with me, he said I believe it was the first 2 minutes, over 200 alarms sounded in the control room. And the way they got that information at the time is they had one of these, it's the old school printers that had the continuous feed of paper.
Right.
And they got
matrix printer, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so they got so many alarms that it took, I think it was 30 minutes for it to print off the alarm they needed to see.
Wow.
So this printing of alarms, and of course that thing frequently jams, and all these problems occur with just the printer that gives you your alarm codes. And so there's things like that when you think about, okay, I'm in a nuclear, control room. I need to be able to make decisions, and I need the information readily available so that I can make the right decisions and comprehend what's happening and make the right calls and adjustments based on the information I'm getting. And so thinking about how do we make information, one, more readily available, but two, easier to comprehend. So, Lean gives us a lot of tools for this, right? The idea of knowing status at a glance, that's a common thing. So you think like, instead of seeing a gauge where I've got to know where the value range is, we'll make it colored, red, yellow, green, and I can just status at a glance and get to comprehend what's the relevant information to me. So those are the kind of things that we can think about, is how do we make these easier to comprehend, easier to project in the future? And projection comes in this as well. And I think this is an interesting thing to think about, because sometimes you can't eliminate stuff, and you've got to have what we call knowledge-based decisions. So an example would be police officers. Police officers have a lot of situational awareness type issues, right? They've got to perceive what's going on. They have to comprehend and understand and project what's going to happen next. So they have to make these short split-second decisions, and those can end up in tragedy. They can end up in success, and they can end up in making sure that the community is protected, the suspect is apprehended without incident, and that the officers are protected. And that's they have to weigh all three of those in their mind at one time. That's a lot for projecting what's going to happen. So when we think about, we have to make these knowledge-based decisions based on these situational, quick bits of information. Well, how do we train people for that? Is it a slideshow where I click through things and tell them how to react? No. Is it a procedure or a work document that sits in a file cabinet? No. The only way you can really train for knowledge-based decisions is through simulation training, repetition. So by having somebody, go out and do practice trainings in controlled, safe environments, that's how you're going to get improved situational awareness issues. Another great example would be the military. The first time you go into active combat, what do they tell you that happens? They say,
other than the biological effect?
Well, the biological. So you get this tunnel vision, your adrenaline spikes, your heart starts pumping, your vision narrows, and you focus so tightly on either the sound of wherever the incoming fire is coming from.
Whatever you're focused on, yeah.
Yep, you get that tunnel vision. And so what do they do to train people on that? They do simulations. They get them used to hearing the sound. They get them more comfortable at making decisions in those situations, and they do practice and practice and practice.
So that stress inoculation.
Exactly. So
the fire service, you're making me think about all of this stuff. I remember going through my drills, and we hated it at the time, but only now can I look back and appreciate it. I had a captain just over my shoulder yelling at us, like barking out commands, throwing stuff, asking us questions while we're going, like putting out this fire in a building, an actual structure. It was a training fire, but still, they set this thing on fire and threw us in there, yelling stuff at us and then giving us scenarios. And like, if you don't inoculate yourself against a certain amount of that stress, it's going to be completely unfamiliar to you. And you could talk about Colonel Cooper's color code of situational awareness at this point, but you go from condition, white, completely unaware, to condition black. You shut down completely. Well, there's varying degrees and graduated degrees in between that you need to be constantly living and operating in and switching between, so that you don't completely shut down. So if we don't inoculate ourselves or our workers, if we don't do simulations and run through certain alarms and malfunctions that they may experience, and so that they can make what you say are these knowledge-based decisions, these are like, it's just muscle memory, right? This is just automatic what you do, because we don't want you to have to think or process that, because we just want you to respond appropriately, right? And then we got to limit the options that you have. And I think cognitive overload is, in my experience, you can correct me if I'm wrong, this cognitive overload sometimes that we put on workers, or just in our environment. You mentioned cell phones, just driving, distracted driving. I mean, you can't multitask. It is a myth. Your brain, I'm talking about thinking tasks, your brain cannot do more than one thing at a time. It switches very quickly between things. So it gives you the perception that you're multitasking, but you're not. You're actually losing time. You're losing cognitive ability to perceive and process, and then of course project, all those three things you talked about. So the more of that stuff we throw on a worker, all these things they have to keep an eye on and track. Oh, and watch this thing that's outside of your periphery, and and keep an eye out for your coworker too at the same time. Oh, and you got to make rate. And there's these quality things we got to be concerned about. How many pieces are returning that you process through your station? Like, that's just, no wonder stuff happens.
Yep. So the thing I think about with this, and I think it's really important when you're figuring out, well, where do I need to actually make situational awareness the norm, and where does it not need to be? So the knowledge-based decisions, and I want to make sure that this is really clear for your listeners here too. When we talk knowledge-based decisions, this comes from Rasmussen's hierarchy here, and he's got, the idea is you've got skill-based, rule-based, and knowledge-based decisions. Skill-based would be push a button, right? It's an easy task. You're basically, I push the button, it does the work. Rule-based might be my procedures, right? I push the buttons in these sequences and they do the work. Knowledge-based is when I have to make some interpretations. I have to have a knowledge of the system and react based on my experience. Troubleshooting is oftentimes knowledge-based. I'm not sure exactly what's wrong. Let me do this combination to get it to work. So a lot of times when you're having to make those judgment calls, that would be where you fall into kind of knowledge-based decisions. My favorite example of this is for when you look at Chuck Yeager. So for those who don't know, Chuck Yeager is the first man to survive breaking the sound barrier.
I say survive.
You got to put survive on there, because the first guy that broke the sound barrier died.
Yeah.
He crashed. Well. And they didn't know why. Right. So imagine you're Chuck and they say, Chuck, you're next. And it's between you and this Boeing pilot here. And we're going to, either the civilian pilot or you, the Air Force pilot, we're going to pick between the two of you. And so the last guy died. We don't exactly know why. We think we do, but we don't exactly know, because nobody had done this before. So, you go ahead and do this. By the way, he did it with a broken, I think it was wrist.
Yeah, something on his arm or wrist or something.
His wrist, I think it was his wrist or his elbow or something. But basically, he had to have a stick to close the cockpit. But anyway, so he goes to do this, and he takes off. He's flying. He goes to brake. As soon as he breaks the sound barrier, basically, you got this laminar flow turns to turbulent flow on the airplane wings, which basically means the physics of your flying aircraft don't work anymore. And so his airplane just starts to flip head over tail. Well, there's no procedure for how to recover from this type of head over tail flipping. Not only that, but also he blacked out. So he blacks out. He wakes up. He's in this spin, and he has to figure out, using his expertise and knowledge and experimentation, of what to do. And so he tries something, and it changes the way his plane is spinning. And now he goes from this way to this way, and suddenly he's in a place where he can recover. So once you get into this barrel type spinning, well, he knows how to recover from that. It's a simple little process and procedure that he's drilled on and trained on. Boom, he's back into rule-based, and he recovers. So you can't tell somebody how they're going to respond in those situations. You've got to rely on their training, their expertise, and their knowledge. So you want to reduce how much that we do of that. You don't really want to be in knowledge-based decision-making. You really want to be in rules or skill-based. So when you can, your first objective, when you realize you're in this knowledge-based, this troubleshooting, this experienced, or the experienced guy know what to do and the inexperienced guy is lost. Well, okay, how do we proceduralize this? How do we make this a checklist, a simple step-by-step process and rules-based process that's going to help these other guys make the right decision? So you want to do that first. If you can make it skill-based, where push the button and you save the world, that'd be great. But when you can't, when you're still in that skill-based, well, what kind of training? So again, I think like, again, for driving, forklifts is a pretty common one, right? Driving is very much a knowledge-based decision, at least in the standpoint of when you're dealing with a very complex environment. You know, warehouses can get pretty complex nowadays with people driving trucks. There's robots, there's pedestrians, you know, there's all sorts of things going on, and you've got to be able
towns everywhere, right?
You know, there's a lot that you have to interpret and be able to make decisions off of. So again, what can you simplify? What can you proceduralize and make it where it's a rote process and not, you know, this ballet of people interweaving? So that's kind of a balance, and figuring out how do you set your system up for success with that is, I think, key. One of the other elements that I think is really interesting with this is when we're talking about how do you get people to not just blame things on people. Well, this is again where that hierarchy comes in, and we think about we need to start at the top. And I think you said this, which is, you know, the higher the risk, the higher in those hierarchies we need to be. My general rule of thumb is for the safeguard hierarchy is at a 4 or better, which means I'm improving human factor design, I'm guarding the target, I'm guarding the target or hazards, so I'm putting the guard in place. I'm removing or relocating the target, putting the person in a safer space, or putting guards around, or making it where the person doesn't have to be involved at all. Or at the very best, I'm reducing or eliminating the hazard. If I can get rid of or make the hazard really small, make that energy potential really small, those are going to be the most effective things we can do in any situation. But specifically for high risk, that's where you got to start at. We really want to start up at the top here, because I really don't want to have to rely on people to protect my system. I really don't want to have to, because people aren't, like you said, people aren't very good at that. You know, memory error comes into play, fatigue, stressors, all of these things can reduce our situational awareness. They can narrow our focus. They can distract us. And the longer we've been doing the job, you know, when you hit that 12-hour mark, maybe the 8-hour mark for some of us, you know, your competency just starts to dwindle really quickly. And so if you have to rely on people as your last line of defense, you've got a very error-prone system. So how can we add better guards, better safeguards in place to prevent the person from being the last line of defense? That's the kind of thinking we want people to have.
Yeah, you mean, you mentioned just how long you've been doing this today. You know, there's a bunch of studies on this, but like overtime, like it costs the business more per hour for the labor, but the productivity typically is lower. Not always, but typically. And you could make the argument, it depends on which studies you look at. I don't know, maybe you've got something you know about this that I don't, which would be great. But like you said, fatigue, everything else. I mean, I don't know what the injury rates are in certain industries for people working on overtime versus during, you know, a regular shift when they've had sufficient breaks and they're well rested. I mean, I know in the military and even in aviation, one of my favorite questions, and I've even recommended back when I was consulting for clients to add this to their little, you know, piece of information that they ask for in their investigation. And that is last full shift worked. And if the worker can give you this information, how many hours of sleep they got last, like, you know what I mean? That's this all influences those things you talked about, their ability to perceive, or it can influence, I should say. And if we don't look at that stuff, we do end up where you said we just put it all on the shoulders of the individual and say, if you were a better person, this wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, and you definitely don't want to be in the line of I always encourage people to gather that information. I definitely don't want to be like, well, you should have slept more or else you wouldn't have had this incident. We don't want that. What we want is to know, are we setting people up in our scheduling to set them up so that they are well rested, so that they have had enough of a break to come in and actually be focused on what they're doing, and that we're not overworking them over a period of time where their performance is going to drastically drop off. And, you know, I definitely have seen the performance drop pretty precipitously for even when you're breaking that 40-hour mark. You can definitely see a performance drop. Now, a lot of times, the industry that I came from, manufacturing, it was working every Saturday, not because we were going to get great productivity numbers on Saturday, but because we needed to catch some schedule attainment number or some other shipping metric, right? That's why we were doing over. We weren't doing it for productivity. We were doing it just to get those extra bit of earned hours, those extra bit of scheduled attainment or whatever our metric was. And so, yeah, you burned the productivity number, you burned the labor number because you're getting all that cost in there. And I used to have guys that they would do that. They would they'd work Sunday if you let them. They would have worked every hour of overtime. And there's some guys that could do that and they didn't make mistakes and they worked well. And there's some guys that, as soon as they got over that hour, they failed. And everybody was a little different, but you could still see even the peak performing guys, their performance would drop off. You hit that, when you get to that 60-hour mark, that 70-hour mark, those 80-hour marks, everyone's performance starts to drop. And I think as an organization, there's even culture, if you're in oil and gas industry, there's a culture of, oh, you only work 40 hours a week. Oh, that's nice. I remember my first job, that's like a badge of pride for them as they work in 80-hour weeks.
Well, what do they call the workers in oil and gas, like on the rigs? What are they called? They're called roughnecks.
Yeah, they're called roughnecks. Yeah.
So you're right. There is a culture, and construction's another one.
Mm-hmm.
We're not saying it's right or wrong. It's just we have to recognize that, at least, right?
Yep. So that idea of, are we setting people up for success or failure with the way we're scheduling them is super important. The one that scares me the most, the oil and gas guys, they're tough guys. They'll handle it. They lose, they get hurt, they'll tough it out, right? That's what we'll say. But the ones that scare me, nurses, doctors, they work a double shift. And you think they're going to nap well during that double shift, that they're going to get enough sleep to be functional to come in and perform surgery on me later? When I come in the hospital.
Now, so what you're doing now is it's one thing. Well, I could argue even with oil and gas because there's an environmental. Look at deep oil, look at Deepwater Horizon, look at Texas City, Texas. Not that those were related to scheduling, but certainly mistakes in those industries have huge impact, environmental or multiple fatalities. But you're right. You're adding a component to this, and that is what's at stake potentially, right? And in this case, it's not just a customer return or a damaged part that gets shipped by mistake, or God forbid somebody gets injured, the worker. We're talking about patient safety. So there is a lot of information available from that industry, from the medical industry, to be able to glean from like some best practices. Not saying we want to run, our warehouse like a hospital, but there's some data there that might be useful.
I would actually say you actually want to go the reverse, because when you look at the data for hospitals, and medical errors specifically, the number is between 90,000 deaths and 400,000 deaths a year due to medical error. Now,
isn't it top 3? It's certainly the top 5, but of cause of death or something like that, right?
It's pretty high up. It's pretty high up there, and it's hard to say exactly where it falls because again, that range is 90,000 to 400 in the U.S. And it's because we don't precisely measure it, which is a sad thing that we don't precisely measure something like a medical error resulting in fatality. But that number, so I think as for a hospital understands fatigue in a way that none of us really should, but yet they don't set themselves up for success from a cultural standpoint. So again, your culture might be inhibiting the right system to reduce errors. And I think that's something that we should all be mindful of, is how are we setting ourselves up from, in this case, situational awareness or fatigue or all these little stressors all these different stressors. Are we setting ourselves up for success in those, or are we prioritizing output? Are we prioritizing, in a warehousing example, right? You've got these rates that you have to hit. And are you prioritizing those over that process of how we maneuver in this area, how we work around each other and work around equipment? And there's a balance that has to be struck. And I think that's something that each organization has to figure out what their balance is and what their true stressors are that are causing people and setting them up for failure. Because I definitely think nurses are set up for failure. We've got Redonda DeVoe coming to our summit in Margaritaville in Texas and Houston in April in 2023. We've got her coming to do a speech on her incident. I don't know if you've heard her incident. It was a medical error. She was convicted, but they gave her a really light sentence. They basically gave her, I think it was 3 years probation for a medical error that resulted in a patient fatality here in Tennessee. And she was set up by the hospital. And I don't mean that in a way of penalizing for the hospital, but she absolutely was set up for failure in this, not just from the equipment that was being used, but the processes. She had to do this manual override. Well, that was a common process that nurses had to do. They had to commonly put in place this override to get around this bug, this in their system that they were dealing with. And so, being set up for failure is not a good thing, especially when it results in criminalization. And so that's something we have to think about in every industry that we're in, is how are we setting people up for success? And from a situational awareness issue, telling someone to be more careful is not very effective. Evaluating your system to see where we're forcing people to be careful at, because we have a bad system that's not very robust, that's setting them up for failure. And the only way they're not going to make a mistake is if they're really careful around here. That's what we want to look for. We want to look for that system part, and don't just blame the person. Don't just tell them to do better next time.
Yeah. I mean, and I think you mentioned it in our last episode. You said even the best of us will make a mistake from time to time, right? And I know from the airline industry, we have like pilots. I think the flying public would be shocked. Maybe they wouldn't, but like how many errors an hour? By the way, what do you have? You probably have the data on this. It's like astronomical, but that's why we've compensated for that. Like in the system, it's the way it's built with the logs or the checklists and automation and having the co-pilot and like all that stuff, right? I mean,
yep. I don't remember the number anymore off the top of my head, but it was something like 200 at every flight or something. It was an astronomical number that you're like, and I fly a lot. So it's like, oh my goodness. But luckily the planes don't fall out of the sky every time somebody makes a mistake.
Right. And I think it's because of what we've talked about is we've shifted that focus from you need to be a better pilot. Yeah, we could all be better at what we do, but the shift was from like, how do we make it harder for that pilot to make a mistake? Or when they do we have resilience in our systems to withstand that mistake? We've nullified the mistake that we know somebody's probably going to make. We've just eliminated it, the impact of it. So that's key, I think. Well, good stuff. As always, Alex, I will have links to TapRoot's website. I'll even have a link to this article on situational awareness. I love the videos that you have in the article.
Yeah, that one's full. It's full of those fun gifts there.
Yeah, I like the one. My favorite by far is this dude. He's so cool. He's got the rope in his hand. He's at the rodeo. And he's like just standing there with his hands on his hips, and he puts his little foot on that gate, and bam, that bull comes busting out of there. Didn't see it coming, did he?
No, there's one. I don't know if it's still on there. There was one that was a tiger that just came out of nowhere.
No, it's not in here.
I think I had to take that one out.
That doesn't play anymore. It might be the one that's
probably the one that doesn't play anymore. I think that one fell. It used to be, there's a person, they were like having a conversation at a car with somebody, and a tiger just comes out of nowhere and gets them. And that's where there's like, you wouldn't have seen that one coming.
No, I know, right? Good. Wow. Good Lord. That's terrible. So yeah, I'll have a link to that article as well. And we'll have to set up our next conversation. We'll just keep this train going, because I think the more conversations we are able to have about topics like these, or all things around how we prevent things from happening, not just respond appropriately, right? I mean, there's two things that I'm thinking about here and working on, and that is we got to have the appropriate response to these things, which kind of gets to what we talked about, the right corrective and preventative actions, the right root causes, but then also move to how we can prevent, after a while, we've got to be able to say, why don't we go out and take a look and maybe see if we can anticipate some things happening? How can we possibly do that? Maybe we can talk about that next.
Yep. How to be proactive.
There you go. It's a novel concept, right? All right, Alex, thanks so much for joining us. I appreciate your time as always, and I look forward to the next conversation.
Always a pleasure. Have a good rest of your day.
All right, there you go. Alex, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with everybody. I know I get a lot out of our conversations each time we have one, and we will continue to have them going forward as well. Head on over to the Safety Pro Podcast community site. You can see the full video version of this interview. No need to sign in or create an account or join the community to watch that video. But while you're there, go ahead and check out some of the other stuff we're doing and consider joining the community, as many others have done as well. And I will talk to you on the next Safety Pro Podcast.